Today I want to quickly talk about a small but unique way in which I've recently noticed that art design / direction affected my experience with the gameplay mechanic of climbing in Breath of the Wild and Horizon Forbidden West. In particular, while simultaneously playing both of these games a couple months ago, I noticed that while they both visually look very realistic in their respective settings, only Breath of the Wild's climbing felt realistic and immersive. If you've played both of these games, this is, to some degree, pretty obvious. After all, in Breath of the Wild, you're pretty much allowed to scale pretty much any surface, from houses to hills to castles, and at some pretty steep angles as well. Link's a pretty seasoned climber. As long as the surface isn't too steep, you can be confident that any vertical surface you walk up to is 100% climbable. In other words, the climbing system in this game is based purely off of the angle of the wall, regardless of what the wall is made of. And there's always a specific angle where running turns into climbing, and past that, there's an angle where you can't hang on to the wall anymore and end up falling. On the other hand, Horizon Forbidden West's system is a bit more finicky. While there are plenty of areas and walls in the game you can scale, this game instead opts for a system where a set of anchors is placed meticulously throughout whatever wall you're climbing. As a side note, I actually find this kind of incredible. I'm not super familiar with how the development process for this game, or games in general, worked, but I can definitely imagine that it wasn't easy to make every single rock formation in this incredibly massive map, and then place in all these footholds. I can't help but imagine some unfortunate game dev missing Thanksgiving and Christmas with his wife and kids, so he can put the little climbing markers on rocks in Horizon Forbidden West. Anyways, back to the topic at hand. You must wonder, why is it important to know all this detail about these climbing mechanics? Well, if we frame the way these mechanics work in the context of the art styles of their respective games, we can see why one is just something you have to deal with, whereas the other one is more immersive. Let's take a look at Horizon Forbidden West again. Being a AAA title on the PS5, it's obvious that the graphics are a little more realistic than that of Breath of the Wild. The world is meant to be photorealistic, and as such, the movement and physics have to be as well for everything to seem believable and coherent. This naturally extends to climbing, of course, which is why the system has to be designed as it is in that game. For the climbing to seem realistic, Aloy needs to look like she's actually holding on to some real outcrops and footholds, and so on. Aloy being able to move around in any direction on a wall like Link in Breath of the Wild wouldn't make any sense, because sometimes there are walls and maneuvers for which that would just seem unrealistic. While this results in very realistic climbing, by being shoehorned into the system, Horizon Forbidden West also unwittingly suffers from some drawbacks. The biggest problem that immediately comes to mind is that because there are a lot more walls than climbable area in the game, there's always some confusion on which walls you can climb. This can be very immersion breaking, especially when the wall you're in front of seems perfectly climbable. Additionally, in my case, this meant I'd be using the quick scan on my surroundings all the time to reveal the possible climbing paths, which is a shame because it messes up an otherwise really beautiful world with a bunch of yellow highlights everywhere. Now, the reason that Breath of the Wild's climbing, at least to me, seems better and more immersive than what I just described is that they get to cheat a little bit. Specifically, since Breath of the Wild isn't made to run on a super graphically capable system like the PS5, and because the Legend of Zelda series has never been one that focuses on photorealistic art design, the world is overall much more cartoony and generally less detailed. However, what it loses out on in photorealism, it gains the player's suspension of disbelief. Basically, because of the more cartoony style of Breath of the Wild, our minds end up filling in a lot of the detail that normally would have been filled in by the game in something like Forbidden West. That is to say, when we see Link grabbing onto a smooth surface in Breath of the Wild, the immersion is not immediately broken, because we assumed that he's doing the impossible task of climbing up a perfectly smooth wall. Instead, due to the lower poly art style, there's an implicit acknowledgement that there probably is something that he's holding on to. It's not perfectly visually realistic climbing, of course, but it's not unrealistic either, and it's definitely arguable that the realism isn't that far off from that of Forbidden West's. Our minds end up maintaining realism by filling in detail where it literally doesn't exist, because of this cartoony art style. Because of this, the game has a lot more freedom in where it can make the character move realistically when climbing. In Forbidden West, doing this would be awkward because you could clearly see wherever Aloy is grabbing onto isn't a real outcrop. Now, this is where we start talking about how these different approaches to realism affect the gameplay experience. In essence, what happens is that in Forbidden West, you end up with walls that look perfectly climbable that you can't climb, as well as sometimes being limited, even on the walls you can climb, since you get locked into specific routes while scaling them. On the other hand, since our suspension of disbelief in Breath of the Wild means that our baseline assumption is realism anytime Link climbs up a wall, he can climb up pretty much any surface without us having to overthink it. In fact, this makes Breath of the Wild more realistic in some respects because your expectation of universally climbable surfaces is always true. It seems like immersion is less of a function of visual coherence as much as it is a function of mechanical coherence. The visual realism in Forbidden West restricts the player, whereas the realism in Breath of the Wild frees them. Honestly, while everything I discussed in this overly long and simple analysis is ultimately pretty obvious and maybe even instinctual to some degree, I also find it kind of fascinating and cool. Our minds, when given the option to interpret things literally or buy into and even augment a constructed reality, tend to choose the latter. Of course, this is also in large part due to really good game design, but even so, I think it's a really cool sign of the adaptability of the human mind that we're so easily able to switch into different modes of thinking with completely different systems of logic, as long as they're consistent. Well, that's pretty much it for this video. If you feel so inclined, feel free to stick around the channel and see what's around. Thanks for watching.